Okay, so I just saw the new Zack Snyder film that just dropped on Netflix, Rebel Moon Part 1. And like a lot of people, I have a lot of things to say about this movie. So let's get into it. Okay, first and foremost, I think the most important thing to talk to you about when it comes to this movie is where I stand on Zack Snyder, because as you know, there is a massive discourse all the time regarding this director. There's people that absolutely hate him, there's people that will defend him like their life depends on it. And it can get a bit much, and it always seems to me that people target a lot of their hate towards Zack Snyder fans, towards Zack Snyder himself. Let's just get this out of the way. This man is just trying to make films. He's not trying to start a cult or something. It's the fans that get really rabid, and you get a lot of a toxic debate between both sides. For the longest time, I considered myself to be a pretty diehard Zack Snyder fan, especially when he was starting the DCEU. I really like the way that he directs superhero films. I do like Watchmen. I do like Man of Steel. Hate me if you want. I do like Batman vs Superman. And I do like Zack Snyder's Justice League. However, whenever he does something outside of superheroes, I just don't think they work quite as well. I've seen films like his Army of the Dead film. 300 is okay, I'll give you that. I watched a little bit of Sucker Punch and I quit pretty much 10 minutes in because I just didn't like it. He just doesn't seem to make films that really connect with me outside of the superhero genre. But to be honest with you, I really wanted him to win me over with Rebel Moon. He's playing into a genre that I quite like, an original sci-fi story. That sounds right up my alley, to be honest with you. And the fact that I heard that this had some light inspiration from Star Wars, that sounded even more interesting. I don't mind some Star Wars, so his take on that just sounded like a great movie to watch. Unfortunately, I found this film to be pretty brutally disappointing. I was expecting a lot more out of Zack Snyder from this film, but then again, it kind of plays into exactly what you'd expect from Zack Snyder. A lot of the tropes that you see in all of his films, an overabundance of slow motion in particular, is something that is definitely present here and way more distracting than what it needs to be. You know, when he plays it right, he can create a pretty epic shot, and he does that a couple of times here. I'll give credit where credit is due, but sometimes it's just not necessary and it looks stupid and it looks tacky. You know, when I heard that this was inspired by Star Wars and was pitched as a Star Wars movie, I wasn't expecting Zack Snyder to almost rip off a lot of elements that you see in A New Hope. I mean, there is a scene that almost blatantly rips off the Cantina one from A New Hope. There's a character in this that is practically Han Solo. There's a character here that's practically Darth Vader. And then there's a character that's practically the Emperor. The beginning of the film as well, and the setup of it all, yeah, it looks a little bit different, but once again, it's just Star Wars. Like, there's no differentiation here. And I just find that to be almost plagiarism, to the point where this isn't just taking inspiration, you're straight up copying something. And I find that to be really disappointing because I think Zack Snyder is a very imaginative filmmaker who has a lot of great ideas. Sometimes he doesn't execute it in the best way, for sure, but sometimes he does. And I was expecting him to really try and do something a little bit more different here than that. And when it does try to do something outside of just being Star Wars, the structure of it is an absolute mess. Pretty much the structure of this film as we get into the second act is basically our main character recruiting a bunch of people for this big mission and uprising that they're planning. And every single character's recruiting moment is separate from the overall narrative, but then it tries to add to the overall narrative. It's just really weird, and it kind of makes you disconnect from every other character because you see their cool scene or whatever, and then from there, they're an afterthought. And because of that, you're getting no real character development, and by the end when we have this massive team, I don't give a shit about any of these characters. I don't remember their names. I honestly cannot remember our protagonist's name because they're just that forgettable and that generic that I just don't give a fuck? When I'm watching all of these individual scenes, as I said, some of them may look cool, and there are some great shots in there, great use of the slow motion, really awesome stuff, but in a narrative sense, I'm questioning, why does this need to take so long? Why are we spending an extended period of time focusing on this action sequence that feels so separate from the overall narrative that it feels pointless? It just feels like amateur hour in terms of the writing, and once again, I find that to be very disappointing. Now, I am really harping on about the things that I didn't like about this movie because, yes, I do find it to be very mediocre, but there are elements of it that I would say that I did like. As I said, there are some really cool shots in here. I do think that the worlds and the way that they're designed can be quite interesting. Some of them, it's just like 3 desert planets in a row, and that's a little bit disappointing. But then there are other planets. There's like a neon cyberpunk kind of world that looked kind of interesting. And where the third act was staged looked pretty cool. It set up a pretty decent third act. And there is some great action. Zack Snyder does really know how to film action. And he does that here. And I guess it just scraped through and did barely enough for me to watch the second one. I didn't completely disconnect from this where I have zero interest in watching the second film in this series. One of these recruiting missions and this sequence really worked with me. It was one that featured a kind of a massive spider. I thought that was really cool, and the way that it played out was just kind of badass. So there are moments in here that I think are really interesting, but once again, it feels just so derivative of Star Wars all the way through this. Even the end, which I won't spoil, is so derivative of Star Wars. It's really bonkers to me how much of a copycat this feels like. Although with that said, our villain I think is pretty interesting. Once again, I don't really remember his name because he's not like a top tier villain, but he does the job. I do think our protagonist does do the job. She is a little bit too wooden and doesn't really have any chemistry with any of the team members, so there is that. But her backstory is quite interesting, and when we go down that route, I find that kind of fascinating. But I do wish there was a way in which Zack Snyder communicated that to us, rather than her just giving us a monologue. I would have preferred these scenes to be played out, probably chronologically, so then we get a slow build up and we begin to care about this character. We have 2 movies here, so you have time to do that. But you don't. Zack Snyder chooses that he wants to do these individual recruiting missions, which probably could have all taken place within a 20-minute sequence. This film, if you boiled it down to what actually happens here, it probably didn't even need to go an hour. That is how thin this narrative is at times. But it's just blown out to over 2 hours. So yes, it is hard not to feel a little bit bored during this film. Also, I am hearing that this is going to have a director's cut that is so different and wild and does exactly what Zack Snyder wants. Now, I was willing to give him a pass in terms of what happened to him at DC and what Warner Brothers did to him. That was totally unfair to him, and I kind of thought that was kind of disgusting what WB did to him. And like everyone, I wanted him to release his definitive vision of Justice League. With this, there are no excuses. Netflix give a lot of freedom to their directors. It's one of the best things about them. They go, here's $200 million, go crazy, bring us something that is going to draw eyes to our platform. They don't really restrict people too much, and I doubt that they did that with Zack Snyder because they already greenlit 2 films for him, and this director's cut was already in the works. It's going to come out apparently 3 months or so after this. So why the fuck is Zack Snyder needing to make 2 films to tell the story correctly? It makes this version of the film kind of obsolete in a way and a waste of people's time. So I find that very frustrating. A director's cut is only needed when a studio cuts the shit out of your movie where it's not really your vision anymore. I fully am on board with that, but this isn't what is taking place here. Zack Snyder almost feels like he's intentionally making a shitty movie so that he can do a director's cut, which is going to be his definitive version. I find that to be just stupid way of approaching a film. He is the only filmmaker, it seems like, that needs to have a rough draft first and then a final copy as releases. And that's just not on, I think. So many great directors are able to tell their story the way they want within their designated runtime. So I don't see why Zack Snyder can't do the same, especially here. What happened to him in DC, warranted. I understand that, and I'm on board with him there. But with this, I'm afraid I'm not on board with that, and I don't agree with having a director's cut here, because guess what? This film did not interest me enough to make me watch it again as a 3-hour version that apparently is going to be better, because I don't know how it's going to be that much better than this. And I'm not really interested enough in exploring that and watching this again. Yes, I'll watch the second installment to see how all of this pays off, but I'm not going to watch this movie again before then. That just seems like too laborious of a task for me that I just don't want to do. The last good thing that I will mention before I wrap up here is there are these robots in the movie. I thought they were pretty cool. There's one that is voiced by Anthony Hopkins. I'm really fascinated to see where Zack Snyder is planning on taking this particular character, because he seems like the most interesting and unique character that he's bringing to the table here. And I kind of would have liked to have seen more about this robot's arc, because it just seemed really interesting from where he begins to where he's at the end of the film. Overall, I know I've said a lot of bad things, but I do think that this film just comes off as really just mediocre as it gets. This film to me, as a score, is a 2.5 out of 5, because I gave Army of the Dead a long time ago on my Letterboxd a 2 out of 5, and I do think that this film is slightly better than that. Only slightly though, so that's why it has a slightly higher score. I'm being overly generous if I go any higher than that. I just don't think this film has enough to really justify its runtime. I think it's very derivative. I would like to see Zack Snyder really be able to tell his vision and his stories within the runtime that he has, especially when he's given unlimited creative freedom from Netflix. I find this really hard to recommend to people, even Zack Snyder fans, because it just doesn't feel like it does anything unique. If you really, really love Zack Snyder's form of visual storytelling, sure, you'll love this. But other than that, as a narrative, it just doesn't work, I'm afraid. I wanted to like this a lot more than I did. I do think it is slightly better than what it's been made out to be by a lot of critics. I mean, giving it a 1 star or something, I think that's a little bit too harsh. It's just mediocre, and that's really all it is. Anyway, those are my thoughts towards Rebel Moon Part 1. Let me know what you think about this movie in the comments below. I really like to hear what you think. His films are just so divisive. So I want to know if you disagree with me. Am I off base here to you, or am I on point? I really want to know what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.